And we are welcoming Gideon Futerman as our speaker today. He is a researcher who has been working in the interaction of SRM and global catastrophic risks since the summer of 2022. His work has involved exploring conflict and SRM workshops and scenarios to explore the range of possible futures involving SRM and climate tipping points, as well as more broadly looking at how to conceptualize global catastrophic risk. Gideon has been involved in the broader geoengineering space for 5 years, first as a youth activist with World Word, and now as a researcher. He is currently a student at the University of Oxford. He has also, I should mention, recently co-authored a report that I think he's going to discuss, and was a lead author for a paper with a number of other folks, a fairly large group that is now under review. Okay, without any further ado, Gideon, the floor is yours.
So yeah, my talk, thanks for that lovely introduction. So I'm going to start out by reading out a short sort of summary of a scenario exercise that I was part of. In particular, this is we used a very particular method, which we can go into later, and then ran a workshop off this. And this is one of the edited scenarios that I wrote based on those discussions at the workshop. And it's particularly focused on conflict. The combination of a severe heat wave and domestic political trends lead to the US to establish unilateral deployment of SRM. It happens that this is quickly followed by a noticeable reduction in climate disasters, leading initially divided global opinions of this program to become broadly supportive and allowing it to continue with only soft governance. The Chinese government grows increasingly uncomfortable, however, with the US domination of SRM, and an unprecedented bad harvest a few years later, which was caused by mismanagement by a slowly weakening CCP, leads to China demanding the US stop carrying out SRM, whilst in secret they develop their own program. Tensions rise, with China accusing the US of impinging on their sovereignty through the SRM scheme, and a small amount of saber rattling ensues. Eventually, an agreement is reached where the USA and China will collaborate over SRM, whilst attempts to enforce a non-proliferation regime beyond these two powers. This regime remained stable for nearly a decade, despite threats initially by Russia to counter geoengineering in an attempt to gain prestige on the international stage and reassert its geopolitical relevance. It fails, as at this stage, few countries see SRM as a significant prestige winner. However, an election in the US changes their policy, with a government coming to power who threatened to pull the US out of many international agreements, including the SRM agreement, which by this point was of very low political salience. China is happy with this, with the CCP looking for ways to gain positive publicity, asserting confidently a Chinese stratosphere for the Chinese century, and creating a sense that hadn't been existing before that SRM dominance is vital for national power. SRM gains a sense of international importance that simply were not there before these Chinese statements, and this leads to the US administration to do an embarrassing U-turn and continue their program. This time in opposition to the Chinese program, combined with neutralization counter geoengineering efforts, with escalating and competitive SRM deployment. This then causes a breakdown of the non-proliferation regime, with a number of countries starting their own SRM schemes in an attempt to present themselves as major powers, or threatening to counter geoengineer as a way of gaining concessions from China and the US. In this febrile geopolitical environment, accusations of weaponization and calls for compensation and termination of specific programs are rife. Leaders of middle powers attempt to gain prestige by challenging and threatening the great powers over SRM and demanding termination, which becomes more dangerous given the breakdown of nuclear non-proliferation the decade earlier. States don't know whether to take these threats seriously, and the frequent emotional responses from leaders concerned with saving face only make the situation more dangerous. Bricksmanship is common, with no state sure where another state's red line is, given the novelty of the situation. Attempts at agreements to de-escalate are regular failures, with states demanding freedom of action over what is considered a vital national security issue, and attempting technological dominance over their adversaries, with SRM one of a number of important areas for this battle for supremacy. The closest to an agreement would have involved an AI-mediated deployment system, but a series of export controls by the US on AI-relevant hardware to China causes China, still in a period of flux following the death of their leader, to pull out of the agreement. In the years following, worries of Chinese technological domination in the US grow. The US government, 3 months before an election where they appear destined to be losing to an even more hawkish government, carry out an attack on a number of unmanned Chinese SRM vessels. The Chinese government, now headed by a new leader, attempting to consolidate power, destroys 90% of the US's manned SRM fleet in response, which is considered an act of war by the US. During the chaos of the previous decade, no first-use nuclear policies had fallen apart, meaning that the US attempts to use nuclear weapons in direct response to this attack on them, with a huge first attack intended to destroy the majority of China's nuclear arsenal, as well as its AI and SRM capabilities. This attack fails to achieve its objective, but it triggers a response from China, throwing the world into a nuclear war. That's just one potential depressing scenario that we can see. And that's one that I've been helping to develop. The point of this talk is to explore more of these and to really explore this question of what is the worst that could happen. And that's really been the purpose of my research over the last few years. So I'm hoping you can all see the slide has now changed. So very quickly, what is GCR, global catastrophic risk? A global catastrophe is something with the potential to inflict serious damage to the human well-being on a global scale. Some people have described it by a particular 10% of the population lost in a short period of time, or in relation to our ability to control it. So beyond the collective capability of national and international governments and the private sector to control. They've also grown up in conversation with this idea of an existential catastrophe, existential risk. The global catastrophic risk being the risk of a global catastrophe, which might cause human extinction or societal collapse. There's been a move towards slightly more complex definitions of GCR, involving these things called critical systems. This is from a paper, Avin et al. 2018, which defines, and this is probably the canonical definition of GCR really, defines GCR as pushing one of these systems that are vital to human, basically to human survival beyond its safe boundaries, and that this pushing of this system beyond those boundaries could spread globally through one of these global spread mechanisms, and that we fail to prevent or mitigate this global spread of these failures, essentially. Quintessential examples, and I'll explain why I sort of resist some of this a little bit later, of global catastrophes have often been people who've been trying to think of AI takeover scenarios or of major pandemics. I basically think the closest that we might suggest that we've ever really got to something close to a global catastrophe is the Black Death, and often has been closely related to the study of societal and civilizational collapse as well. And so people have also suggested sort of that failure of society to also be part of it as well. Why might we care? Very quickly. Well, firstly, we don't want to die. At the very extreme ends, global catastrophes will be killing everyone. Even on the lower end, are causing very significant damages. And there's an idea that studying GCR and understanding this is part of prudent risk assessment. I don't know if any of you read the Climate Endgame paper that came out in PNAS last year, but this makes a very similar argument as to why it's useful. Is even if the chances of these very large, very, very bad catastrophes are unlikely, it's still really important that we work on them, because we regularly do things to stop things with 1% chance or even less of happening that could cause serious issues. You know, we will wear a seatbelt when we get in a car. And I think, you know, if GCR risk could well be on that sort of scale of probability, if not higher. It also has this interesting relationship with existential risk, which some people have suggested is uniquely bad because it loses all potential future value in the future. That's one reason people have considered existential risk bad. There's other reasons related to obligations to the past and all sorts of things. And don't really need to go into the ethical arguments. But it's also, yeah, it's not obvious that we can stop a GCR scaling to, a global catastrophe scaling to an existential catastrophe. So it's not obvious that we can draw this fine line between these, and these are where some of these obligations to future generations, obligations to the past come in. I think it links less well into animal-centric or ecocentric ethics, actually, but it's still, there are plausible arguments you can make that from that. What I think that's important to put this in context, though, is weighing different risks with different severities, different people and groups that are impacted, and different probabilities of happening, as well as different uncertainties, is inherently value-laden. And I'm mostly going to be making an argument and discussing the risks involved with SRM and how SRM could contribute. But we could come to the conclusion that SRM is more of a contributor than a mitigator of GCR, and still think it's prudent to go ahead with it for all sorts of other reasons, whether we think it's justice concerns or concerns around the more likely contributors to risk, which may not contribute to these very worst case risks, but still may kill millions of people. So it's important to know that this is I believe this should be a part of a risk assessment, often which is not taken into account. Certainly on climate, the IPCC doesn't discuss this stuff. There's not really been much discussed in the literature of SRM and GCR, but I don't think this is necessarily the only thing we ought to be taking into consideration. Oh, okay. I don't know why that prior work slide's not working. I thought I had some papers up there. Essentially, there's before I came into this, there was probably roughly 3 papers that explicitly worked on this question. There is Baum et al. 2013, which works on termination shock, called Double Catastrophe, trying to show, and I'll come into this later in my discussion of termination shock. There's Halstead 2018, which I think tries a similarly ambitious thing to what I'm trying. I don't come to ridiculously different conclusions, but basically suggests that the impact of SRM on this is so radically uncertain that it's not necessarily productive to work on this if you care about existential risk. And probably the most comprehensive and the most recent work, Tang and Kemp 2021. This is one of the things I discussed on the Review 2 podcast. I interviewed Aaron Tang on that, which does a broad range picture of this. Nonetheless, this seems to be
it seems your slides are frozen. I don't know if that's intentional.
No, just this slide.
Just this slide. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Is this just yeah, this one for some reason the things didn't load that I wanted them to, because you've now seen this change slides. So those were those 3 papers. I don't know why it's not come up. I can send them later. And there still seems to be much more fertile ground. A lot of those were very shallow dives, often trying to answer what I've described as sort of the big question of SRM. Does, on balance, SRM contribute to global catastrophe to GCR, or even just how could it? And I felt that there needed to be much more detail. We were very far away from actionable ideas. We hadn't really explored the possibility space, and that's what I set out to do. And in the workshop report, I'm hopefully going to be, if I have time, writing a paper where I expand this sort of causal loop diagram. But we came up with all these intersecting factors. You'll notice that lots of these don't directly cause, a global catastrophe. But one thing that's important is we're not just looking at what's the direct trigger. I wanted to open up that black box a little bit and try and piece together, how do the various actions that we're taking now, how could these impact on global catastrophic risk at the end of the day? And I'll be talking about that in a little bit. So why is SRM and GCR hard? I think it's a really hard question from both an SRM and GCR perspective. So one of the first reasons, and why making this overall sort of big assessment is really hard, is because climate change and GCR and global catastrophic risk is understood very poorly. There is very little research that has been done into worst case scenarios around, or realistic worst case scenarios around climate change. There's very little work that's been done on looking at plausible pathways by which climate change could contribute to things like societal collapse. The literature is growing, but at a very slow rate. And obviously, one of the major benefits of SRM is it could mitigate some of those or reduce some of those climate impacts. And so it's very hard to be making an overall assessment if one half of the risk assessment is this massive question mark. In fact, I would go so far and say I think our understanding of how SRM could contribute to global catastrophic risk is better than our understanding of how climate change could. Part of this is because of the way we conceptualize GCR. Historically, and this is in my introduction, Ron mentioned I was working on how can we study GCR, complex GCR, and things like this. And I basically, historically, in the GCR space, it's been focused on what sort I've heard be called the sledgehammer approach. I think that's Konstantin Arnscheider at the Center for Study of Existential Risk has called this. The sort of the single thing that's going to come and kill you in one go. It's like as S.J. Beard, who I worked quite closely with for a lot of this work, described it. It's like we're looking for that asteroid, the one asteroid which can come, wipe everyone out in one go. It comes from far away, exogenous to us, not including any complex processes or anything. Of course, even if asteroids would come and cause extinction, it would not be like that. But we're looking for that sort of almost like shot from the blue, one shot, one like almost miraculous destruction of, heavenly destruction of everyone, and we can't do very much. And tries to separate GCR into discrete risks. And you see this a lot in, for instance, probably the most prominent book on global catastrophic risk called The Precipice by Toby Ord. He explicitly discusses risks as separate things and gives separate probability for each of these risks. The word risk is actually often used for as synonymous with hazard, or even as synonymous as event or catastrophe, where obviously these things mean very different things. Instead, to study SRM and GCR, we need to conceptualize GCR beyond this direct hazard-centric approach, but that's difficult. It requires basically making new ground there. Vulnerabilities, exposures, cascades needs to be looked into, and risk analysis is really hard because not only do we have to try and deal with this very complex, often diffuse, often asymmetric processes where it's helping in one way, it's very different to the way it could be harming, but actually this, and one thing that I sort of, one of my conclusions from this year is how much SRM contributes to global catastrophic risk is very dependent on how SRM is carried out. I don't just mean physically, I mean the political circumstances. Meaning that it's very hard to carry out a risk analysis when so much of that stuff's inherently in flux. Because there's, it's almost as if we ought to be carrying out a risk analysis of all the different possible ways that our actions could be contributing or mitigating our actions related to SRM could be contributing or mitigating risk. And indeed, that's one of the things I was quite interested in is looking at some of those actions. So yeah, here's some of the attempts to conceptualize climate change in GCR. And this is a lot of what the work looks like. It's hard. It gets very complicated, gets very messy. And at the moment, I don't think it has a ridiculously strong evidence base. I think it seems obvious that climate change is not something we can dismiss as a significant driver of GCR. But people who are working explicitly to put out these pathways of how climate change could realistically cause things like societal collapse, there are very, 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 very few researchers working on this. Exceptionally small, which is a bit crazy. So anyway, one of these more direct paths that have been raised in the literature quite a lot is conflict and tensions. I'll get onto some of the more disparate and complex parts a little bit later, but I'm going to first do conflict and tensions, then termination shock, and then those more complex parts. I'm writing a paper at the moment with Peter Rautenbach on this, and we are hoping to submit this at some point soonish, because I think this is possibly the most important part, one of the most important factors as to where SRM contributes to GCR. If no conflict and tensions are involved, if you have a sort of benign authority just looking over the SRM, none of this politics, none of the geopolitics over this, we're in a much, much safer position. Of course, that's not going to happen. I think this is quite possibly that. However, there's been very little prior work done on how SRM could cause conflict. There is basically no paper that looks explicitly just at this question, despite the fact that conflict has been commonly discussed as a threat, a risk involving SRM. It's how interstate conflict, war, is really what I mean here when I'm talking about conflict. And counter geoengineering is also rarely considered. As far as I can tell, there's one paper that considers counter geoengineering really in the context of conflict, Basan Mukherjee 2020, which uses some game theory, but it's so rarely considered. And also, it's going to be important to expand this consideration beyond conflict, and this has been a bit more discussed to include tensions and conflict and war, to include tensions as well, which I'll discuss a little bit later when I talk about termination. So how could we get conflict from SRM? How could we get war? Well, the first factor is you need to actually securitize. There needs to be certain securitizations that occur. And I'm drawing off theory by the Copenhagen School. I think a great foundational text, if you want to read, is Buzan et al. 1998, Security, a New Framework for Analysis, which is what this essentially securitizing theory is based on, basically holds that the sort of objects that we securitize, we treat as objects of security, as things that can have these sort of exceptional measures, including conflict, aren't like inherent. They're socially constructed and, importantly, intersubjective. It's neither objective nor just anyone can say it. It's an intersubjective process. It requires, in particular, and whilst there's been controversies over this logic, most of those controversies make it look rather still similar to this, the establishment, the statement of something as an existential threat by an authority, often the government, which has the capacity to securitize. And this justifies the use of exceptional measures in response, breaking the normal rules of politics, and that this is accepted by the relevant audience. One example of securitization that we've often probably all seen in our own lives recently is related to COVID. This happened very quickly. The idea that that the government can order you to be locked in your home is frankly a ridiculous, in normal times, we would consider this to be a ridiculous overreach of government authority. But because the government, I'm not against lockdowns, but because it was successfully framed as this sort of existential threats to us, COVID, the people very often gave the government's permission and to break these rules, lock us down in our homes, do these exceptional measures. And I know certainly in the UK, you definitely saw a breakdown of this securitization as time went on as well. But not all securitizations can lead to conflict. While securitization makes something part of security and most elements of military matters are securitized, and war is almost inherently securitized in the modern world, not everything that's securitized could lead to conflict. We were never going to war over COVID, for instance. And I don't think, and climate change hasn't been particularly successfully securitized. So we have to answer this question of why might SRM be securitized if climate change hasn't been. The first element of this is intentionality. Unlike climate change, SRM, and particularly any sort of climate disasters, sort of damages that have been caused by climate change, will have a shorter causal chain. It's much easier, unlike climate change, which is sort of everyone has this disparate responsibility over long periods of time. It's much easier to blame an individual, the one state carrying out SRM, the group of states carrying out SRM, if there's any climate disaster. Importantly, it doesn't actually require the climate disaster to have actually been caused by SRM. We know a lot of climate disasters today are blamed on climate change, even before there's much good evidence of whether climate change has actually contributed to that specific disaster. And it seems perhaps even more so when there's an obvious threatening other that this could happen in SRM. Okay, so that's super important because that suddenly changes the game. One problem with climate change being securitized, particularly in a way that can allow conflict, is there's no threatening other. In SRM, there very clearly is. Yeah, there is a state who, if you've had a famine in your state and the people are up in arms against it, you're worried. You need to deflect blame. You need to find an enemy that's caused this rather than your own mismanagement. There is a threatening other you can blame. That state carrying out SRM, whether or not it was that state's fault. This is the other point. Because of the inherent sort of social constructiveness of this process, to some extent, it doesn't matter hugely whether SRM actually works very well or not. A lot of the studies, a lot of the physical science does show SRM would probably reduce a lot of climate hazards, although in many cases wouldn't be improved relative to today. And that might be quite important for public perceptions. That doesn't mean states aren't going to blame. We know a lot of very, very important policy is not made based just on rationality, particularly when it comes to blaming of other states and tensions, particularly in worlds where we see the rise of populism. We've seen this all the time. We saw this during COVID, seen this past this, and seen this before this as well. Secondly, why SRM might be securitized, or might also allow climate change to be securitized, and this is drawing off some work by Danielle Young from earlier this year, is it provides a legible solution to climate change that can be considered as a legible security solution. One of the problems with climate change being securitized at present is people go, it's an emergency, we're all going to die, oh my God, this is an existential threat. And then the solutions are things like long-term emission cuts, are things like, let's have binding targets, are things like, we need to come to some consensus, cooperate together, build institutions. And, it's none of the sort of rapid quote unquote sexy stuff that sort of needs to be done as an immediate legible solution to a security problem. SRM is that. SRM is an exceptional measure, which is what you need to do this. That seems to combat the problem quickly with obvious intentionality, and the securitized state can go and do this. So that's how SRM would sort of provide a legible solution. Similarly, to the state that wants to securitize the SRM, wants to say the SRM is dangerous, they can go, well, they've got a solution lined up as well. You know, they can go, well, we just need, you know, the silver bullet, the only solution to our problem is we stop that country doing the SRM, either by using counter geoengineering, which again is available as this sort of silver bullet. I'm not saying it actually does this, but, you know, this silver bullet, legible security solution that only requires one driver, which is what you sort of want for these security, for these exceptional measures to carry out, or you cause a military attack on that state as well. You might say a lot of this stuff is counterproductive. It makes the problem worse, not better. This happens all the time. This is part of what people have often considered to be the security dilemma. Very often, states take actions designed to help their security, which end up hindering this. Happens very often. Another reason why SRM might be securitized and you might see an overall securitization once SRM happens, where climate change might not. And this is drawing off some work by Duncan McLaren and Olaf Corey from earlier this year. Is the idea that actually climate change may have been securitized in a very different way. It's typically those people who are, you know, it's climate protesters and refugees and these sort of groups that are sort of coming about as a result of climate change that gets securitized. They're the existential threat. It's not, you know, they're an existential threat to other society. You know, that the paper is helpfully titled "Our Way of Life is Not Up for Negotiation." The idea is it's actually those people calling for radical action on climate change or fleeing, you know, or being climate refugees because of this, that are seen as the existential threat to the elites. And so a lot of the solutions that might fit that legible solution criteria, things like radical mitigation, are simply not seen as too dangerous to the elite's position, are seen as threatening the very referent objects that the existential threats to. SRM doesn't do this. Nor does counter geoengineering, or at least doesn't obviously do this. Of course, if it leads to conflict, it absolutely would, but it doesn't obviously do this. And it you know, and it can fill this criteria of being a big, you know.
How are you?
It can sort of fill this criteria of this that when an extreme reaction is needed, SRM is an immediate, obvious, quick, or counter geoengineering, immediate, obvious, quick solution to these. And you end up with a situation of climate disasters as well, where again, it is a thing that can, rather than the sort of longer term, more diffuse solutions to climate disasters, which we might often see now, SRM is a solution that you could have to climate disasters instantly. And this might mean that states, if you can securitize climate change, and SRM starts to be seen as as fundamentally necessary to the survival of your state, to the survival of your population, then another state telling you to stop might be seen as a deep infringement of your sovereignty, or even as an attack. You're not going to go to war over another state stopping. So we need the other side as well. We actually need these two securitizations. We need one state to consider SRM so important that they would never back down if another state tells them to stop. And that's where a lot of this securitization, as I said, is coming in. If you see SRM as your solution to what you can now say is the true existential threat of climate change, which you can play up to the level that we often play up other security problems, then you're not going to give in when another state tells you to give in. On the flip side, another state might consider SRM to be itself an existential threat. They've had a major famine, which will happen under an SRM world just as much, you know, maybe less than a climate change world, but no one lives in that counterfactual, and they need something to blame. They blame the SRM. You know, there's all these other features that I've just spoke about, all that checklist. SRM lets that apply to climate change, and obviously it could apply equally to SRM itself. And that other state might start carrying out counter geoengineering if the first state doesn't give in. So if this securitization has happened, then how can you get to conflict? Because again, as I said, even if these are sort of conflict facilitating securitizations, threatening others, existential threats, etc., it doesn't necessarily mean we can get to conflict. So we lay out also some pathways to conflict as well, based on James Fearon's paper, Rationalist Explanations for War, 1995. Essentially, the idea is state A deploys SRM in response to a climate change disaster or whatever. In response to having securitized climate change, state A deploys SRM or sort of concurrently. SRM impacts the climate. It could work as intended. We don't, the climate doesn't need to look bad on this, but it will, and quite plausibly will be perceived to cause climate disasters, even if it does not in fact. This causes a climate disaster in state B. State B considers therefore the SRM, and potentially by this malicious other state A, to be an existential threat to its population, securitizes it, and demands the end of the SRM project, and maybe also demands compensation for the alleged SRM disaster. There's one pathway where it just sees where state A sees those demands as an immediate read to go to conflict, or vice versa. State B, basically, if state A doesn't give in to its demands, it goes to war, because it's sort of response to the perceived aggression. It considers the first one to be an attack on its territory, the SRM to be an attack on its territory. The state refusing to back down sort of confirms that. It carries out conflict. I think that's quite unlikely. It's not impossible. But if the option of counter geoengineering is available, they're quite likely to go down that route. So state B starts counter geoengineering. Methods used during SRM or counter geoengineering could inherently raise the risk of inadvertent escalation. So, for instance, neutralization, where you have one plane following closely behind another. Is an inherently hostile act, and if there was a aviation disaster involving the two planes crashing, that could well be seen as an act of war. Similarly, depending on the more congested airspace gets with military planes, which these SRM planes could well be, it inherently raises the risk of inadvertent escalation. There's also the case of, as we saw in the scenario I read at the start, if one state sees attacking the other state's SRM vehicles as dangerous, but not as an act of war, because let's say they're unmanned drones, whereas the other state would perceive that as an act of war, then you could get this crossing of this misperception line. The second thing that could happen after state B starts counter geoengineering in particular is state A has already, they're refusing to back down over this. They consider SRM to be so important for their national survival. The climate change, which now state B is seen as being on the side of, because they're putting this counter geoengineering into the air. Suddenly, climate change isn't this disparate problem without threatening either. It's got a face of that state that's opposing them. State A demands state B stops. Obviously, state B is not going to stop, and so state A could attempt to force state B to stop doing counter geoengineering, maybe in an attempted targeted attack. That might hopefully, not, they don't want it to cause an all-out war, but they want to stop the counter geoengineering. State B perceives that as crossing a red line because it's going to be infringing on their sovereignty. And so state A, and so you end up with war. There's more subtleties to this, so we can go into this in the discussion, but that's the rough picture. And laying this out, conflict, if SRM gets securitized, after both SRM and its inverse get securitized, if those facilitating securitization seem plausible, then scarily conflict doesn't seem likely, but seems eminently plausible, even in a world where SRM works very much as intended, let alone tensions, which could cause other things. And that's where we move into termination shock. Sorry, this is running a little bit over, and I'm going to try and hurry through this a little bit now. Parker and Irvine, 2018, critique rightfully some of the assumptions behind termination shock and lay out some plausible pathways. Termination shock has been surprisingly under-examined in the literature. Plausible pathways to how it could occur, and actually the plausible consequences of termination shock have been really under-examined. Following Parker and Irvine and some other work as well, it does seem to me there are two likely triggers: a global catastrophic event, or something close to that. This is explored in Baumetal, as it's also explored in a paper or a report, but it's sort of unclear which it's going to be, that I've been writing with Trisha and Patel, who's worked with the Degrees Initiative on pathways to potential termination from these. But it's still not obvious how bad does this global catastrophic event have to actually be, and can actually we reduce the chances of that happening by purely technical means. I think with my work with Trisha, we mostly found that most of the realistic pathways to termination from a global catastrophic event was still socially mediated. It wasn't just we had no capacity to do it and then we couldn't rebuild. Because remember, for termination shock to occur, you need to terminate and not restart. And that requires the event to be extraordinarily bad, or I'll explain a bit later, for it stopping another state to basically block, normally by threat of conflict, the ability for this to restart, or the threat of conflict. If one state, states may rightfully think that, at any point in that pathway, state A/state B, but state A might rightfully think that termination shock of the SRM is less dangerous than an all-out, war, potentially even a nuclear war would be. And I don't think state A judgment there is necessarily wrong. And so that's the other pathway. But we don't really, it does seem to be plausible that there might be some states that would threaten conflict over this, just as laid earlier, and states that might even securitize SRM quite heavily, be happy to back down if it means avoiding, or not happy, but be a back down if it means avoiding something like nuclear conflict. We also don't know, and this is not something I researched this year really, but something that came up from the workshop as well. We don't know how bad termination shock is. We have some ideas that termination shock would be bad, but obviously I'm trying to look at how bad can this get, and very little plausible understanding of how bad can it get. How does that termination shock impact food systems? How could those food systems impact political systems, social systems? We understand, it comes back. The thing that we can basically say about termination shock is it probably would be as bad as climate change on steroids, but partially because we don't quite know how bad climate change could be from a global catastrophic risk perspective. It also seems really hard to know how bad termination shock could be. And so whilst we often present termination shock as sort of like an end game, that this would lead to a global catastrophe, it's not obvious to me that termination shock fills those criteria. It's not obvious to me that it doesn't. And it seems quite likely that it majorly contributes. But that's one area that I could say that people ought to be researching, is how bad could termination shock be. So from my work with Trisha, here's some example pathways just to show you how much, and just a bit of discussion. This is not published yet, but how you could potentially lead to termination. So one is you get a volcanic eruption, but in reality, it could be a lot of other things. This causes a volcanic eruption, a very large scale volcanic eruption causes food shortages, mass migrations, and other sort of cascading impacts from, including particularly economic impacts. There's been some recent work showing just how bad various volcanic eruptions could be for the global economy, shutting down major shipping lanes, and the sort of cascading impacts that could have as well. Particularly if multiple went out of once. Because of this, because both of the SRM injected into the stratosphere, because of the chaos, and also perhaps because leaders therefore can't agree exactly what to do, exactly where to calibrate this, things like that, you may see a temporary termination. Because not to add to the cooling, and if other more technical calibrations can't be agreed in time because of the nature of the governance arrangement, you could very much see this. The famines could develop from these food shortages and other issues, and you get that and global political unrest. Leaders blaming the famines and even potentially the volcano, and we'll come into potential role of conspiracy theories in a tiny bit, on the SRMs, on SRM, they rise to power. You don't need many of them. You need one in a powerful state. Populist leaders that are leaning into conspiracy theories are something that we know happens in times of crises. Indeed, we also come up with a very similar pathway to this of a global pandemic, and this is one way maybe we see is even more plausible, where the pandemic is blamed on SRM. Of course, we know there's no scientific basis to this, but we know there exist people out there already who are blaming SRM for mind control. Indeed, it's one of the most dominant discourses of SRM on the internet, and we know that there are people who've got to the very highest officers in nuclear armed states who believe conspiracy theories with very little evidence. So we can't just unfortunately can't just dismiss this stuff as conspiracy. Threat and conflict over restarting SRM. Given the domestic chaos in this slowly collapsing economy, no leader would have the political will to combat this. No leader would be like, I want to restart. My state's falling apart under these sort of terrible fallout of this volcanic eruption. I have no interest in, and this other state is threatening conflict to anyone that does this. SRM is not particularly popular in my state. I have no interest in doing this. I'll let someone else go first. And no one does. Because of this threat, termination shock occurs, maybe creating a double catastrophe by worsening this ever worsening crisis. That's one pathway. There's a lot more I could go into. Here's a couple of other summaries of some drivers. Oh, sorry, I think one or two of these got missed out again. Maybe this is a slightly old version of the PowerPoint. Apologies, but solar storm or pandemic gets blamed on SRM by conspiracy theorists. States demand termination. The collapse of the global economy focuses political attention away from SRM. The deploying state stops. No other states agree to take it up in the face of a fractured geopolitical landscape where they might see it as dangerous. Generally, extreme weather events might be blamed on SRM. Is other pathways, the rise of religious and extremist groups that are opposed to SRM on fundamentalist grounds, not because they think it's anything particularly wrong, but it's fundamentally an abomination. Could also see this happening. And there is this potential point where once a catastrophe or something else stops SRM, whilst technically it's very feasible to get it up and running in that window, the political will required to get a new system up and running, create a new agreement once one agreement's fallen apart, may just be too much for many states. And they may, we've seen states be, whilst termination shock would be a quite quick crisis, it would still play out on sort of decadal timescales. We know leaders have regularly not been willing to take sacrifices. Look at the early days of COVID over crises that were playing out over the matter of weeks to months. Let alone those that might, like termination shock, which might be over a year to a decade. So it's not obvious that leaders would respond in the way we'd imagine they would to something like termination. We also try and open up the black box a little bit, and I'm sorry I'm running a little over, and I'll try and finish this off. We can ask about more of these questions later, as well as reading the stuff that I've the workshop report, which contains much of this, as well as the papers that will come out over the next year or so. But we've been dealing here with big picture geopolitical, technical questions. And I'm not sure how amenable these are to us working on them. During these sets of scenario exercises that I run with a number of people in the SRM community, the survey averaged 22, with how on a 22, on a scale of sort of 0 to 100, of how much participants who are all members, or almost all members of the SRM research community, felt they could influence those scenarios. So it's not tiny, but it's not huge. So are there important sub-factors that might influence all these? And how can we impact these today? And that's what my workshop laid out to do. And we assessed that, yeah, there are, things like the types of deployment might be really important, whether they're manned or unmanned might be really important in allowing conflict to happen or not. Whether you're doing wild deployment, which is maybe a quite dangerous scenario, where deployment is sort of injected in lots of different sites. You maybe have regional marine cloud brightening that gets scaled up. You maybe get marine cloud brightening with stratospheric aerosol over the top. Once you get political interests involved in this, the deployment might look increasingly wild. Maybe we can guide against those, but maybe we can't. That's one potential sort of sub-factor. Strength and stability of governance arrangements. If governance arrangements, and similarly existing frameworks and patchwork arrangements, government arrangements are strong and can lay stable with sufficient buy-in for long periods of time, that's pretty, that's pretty good. Whereas on the other hand, if they're very weak and don't have a lot of buy-in, if they're really only there as sort of marriages of convenience, we're in a much worse position. I see there's 2 hands up. So should I answer them now, or?
I would suggest that maybe you find a way to conclude, because we're not going to have enough time for discussion, and you've raised so many things that it's I think
I'm going to conclude very
kind of overwhelmed us with your
sorry. I'm going to conclude very shortly. Okay, so here's this, and I can go into any details of these in a little bit. So just very quickly on the recommendations. Here are some of the recommendations that I'd say of what more research is needed. I'll let you very quickly all read this rather than going through this. And then here's some of the recommendations that I'd say for policy and governance as well, based on the workshop report. I think multilateralism can and ought to be fostered through SRM research, particularly focus on collaboration between USA and China, and perhaps also other states like Russia, the UK, India, Pakistan. Really important. If we can get multilateralism going in the scientific community, this may well translate into policy work. I think this is a lot of the foundational ideas behind degrees as well, but I don't think this is going on enough. If I was going to say one sort of silver bullet thing scientists could do, a major research collaboration between a US center, perhaps at a prestigious university with high connection to the field, and a Chinese center would probably be my single biggest recommendation in the near term. Governance frameworks around SRM will require widespread sustained buy-in, and we end up in much more dangerous situations when they don't. We need to establish the legitimacy of any governance effort early on. They need to be inclusive, and there can be work. And by that, I mean anything. I mean, including if we think there should be a non-use agreement. Frankly, this needs to be inclusive, and there needs to be widespread sustained buy-in, and that's very difficult. And we must not overstate the importance of SRM or climate change, as well as not understate it, because we need to resist securitization. Securitization is one of the most dangerous things that we could happen to this. Particularly securitization in those conflict enabling forms in particular. So we need to be careful in our communications, in our way of doing things, in our governance, that SRM is never something that states would ever consider going to war over. And sorry for that being so sort of long, but that's my presentation done.
Okay, thank you very much, Gideon. You've certainly provided a lot of food for thought here. Okay, so so let me let's just start with the questions, and hopefully everybody can have a chance to who wants to discuss this. Robert, how about I'll just put down the names in the order of the queue as far as I can tell. Sorry, go ahead, Robert.
I have so much to say about this fascinating presentation that I'm going to be really, really brief. Gideon, you're in Oxford, correct?
Yes.
Well, can we meet up? I'm in Tunbridge Wells. We can meet up. I'll come up to Oxford or I'll meet you in London, because I have major issues with this presentation and the material you presented. And I think there are the fundamental questions about the entire premise for this work, which really need to be examined in detail. They're not going to get examined in this conversation because there's too much to talk about and it's too fundamental. But I would really, really welcome the opportunity to meet you in person and talk through some of these things. I mean, a lot of the people you quoted, I know personally. Olaf Corrie was my internal examiner for my PhD, and Andy Parker, you referenced somebody I know back, so I know Peter Everett, all these people, I know these people. And a lot of the work that a lot of the references you've used are work I'm familiar with. So I think that we could have quite an interesting conversation. So
yeah,
perhaps
I'd love to.
Yeah, if I may, we got if I can get your email address, if you could put it in the chat, I will email you.
Yes.
We'll set it up, and I'll leave it at that for others who aren't so much at hand to use the time now.
Okay, thank you, Robert. An invitation for dialogue. Sev.
Yeah, Gideon, there are very many kinds of cooling intervention which can be made by solar and thermal radiation management methods. Quite a lot of them actually can be done at very small scales and would not have much conflict effect. For instance, my buoyant flakes idea, brightening the ocean surface, that can be done by island states, by any kind of groups, and it would be very hard, I think, for any particular government to say, you are a baddie, stop, I'm going to attack you. Have you thought that there are some methods which are a lot less likely to be securitized than others?
It seems, yeah, I think this is like a decent point. Whilst securitization is a process that's socially constructed, it's very true that the technical characteristics of these things very much do matter. Whilst they don't decide the be all and end all of that, and ultimately in some ways anything can be securitized, it is true that it is just sometimes looks far more ridiculous to do this otherwise. I was particularly obviously over this year and a half, 2 years I've spent working on this, focused on what are the primary proposed SRM solutions, because particularly if we find these to be very dangerous for whatever reasons, this is quite useful. I've not looked into that other stuff. I'd be very surprised if technical characteristics were not part of it. If you saw a big diagram of these sort of factors, the types of deployment, which includes the technology, is hugely impactful on all sorts of things. And so I think you're very right to bring that up. I've not looked into detail, unfortunately, at what you've proposed, and would need to do that before I could cast judgments on how it would interact with a lot of these interests. So yeah, sorry if that's not as overly satisfying answer, but
No, that's fine.
Mike.
Thank you. I guess the first thing I'd sort of take issue with is this issue of not being over concerned about climate change. I mean, I think that is pretty clearly a global catastrophe risk in many, many ways, whether it's, Antarctica or food crisis or environmental refugee stimulation or all sorts of things. I mean, I think you seem to be starting from a framework where climate change isn't a really drastic threat. When I look at paleoclimate, the equilibrium sea level sensitivity from the past 20,000 years and ice age melting is like 15 meters per sea level per degree change in global average temperature. So it seems to me one has a clear risk, and one has to start from that kind of thing. Now, whether the public understands that is something else, and I wholeheartedly agree with you that IPCC and not enough research has been done on it. In fact, IPCC, I think, uses a very poor metric for what's happening by using time lag decadal average, global average temperature change, which just gives no hint of the kind of disasters that could really occur, and that they should be talking much more about risks. I guess I'd also say I would have thought that I know really big volcanic eruptions have caused some effects, but it's hard really for me to see how SRM is going to cause anywhere near that kind of threat. And then I guess the question I wanted to ask was, so the world made it through the Cold War. The nuclear weapons were developed as a way to suppress, to prevent or try and threaten land invasion in Europe, and Europe been going on for so long. And it would be much easier, it certainly was much easier, to get to a catastrophic outcome from the situation in the Cold War than what would happen with respect to, I think, SRM and climate change. I mean, I don't like this idea of a single country thing. I think they're going to be blocks of countries or something like that. I mean, it's going to be much more difficult and more cohesive than that. And then finally, just to say, you act as if it's SRM or nothing when there are all kinds of nuances of what one could change and adjust about it, about what latitude you do it or how you do it. And so what I've been thinking of, you start small and learn and adjust, and you certainly watch out for the kinds of risks and things that you're talking about. The real challenge is going to be getting the public to keep believing that climate change is as disastrous as it can be without it experiencing it. I think that's the challenge, to keep it going or something. So
yeah, I'm happy to provide a response to some of this. Firstly, I very much don't mean to downplay the impacts of climate change from two perspectives. Number one, I don't think GCR is the be all and end all of everything. Climate change, I happen to think climate change can contribute quite heavily to GCR. But even if it didn't, that wouldn't actually massively decrease its ability to contribute. Nor do I happen to think climate change is not a big contributor to GCR. I was working over the summer as a research manager on, as far as I know, what was the largest research team explicitly talking in the terms of GCR and SRM, which is and climate change. It's not a big team at all. It was only five mostly graduate students. What I wanted to stress actually is just that we don't really know the pathways. We have some inkling that it could be that sea level rise is much worse than we think, or more importantly, it could be that we get, even if actually all the IPCC's all the sort of physical assessments the IPCC makes and these models make are completely correct, but society is far more vulnerable to climate change than we think it is. Because all it takes, it might be that, we're mostly okay, except for in that 1 in 1,000-year event, there's now 1 in 100-year event. And we've not looked at a load of things. So what I'd rather say is the reason it's really hard to make a risk assessment of SRM is because its biggest benefit, we don't understand properly, not just the magnitude, but also the exact pathways by which climate change could contribute to GCR. And that's a real call to work on. I think more work needs to be done on these worst case climate scenarios to understand how needed is SRM. When you say states and blocks, yeah, I basically also buy that it will be blocks, it will be minilateral. that doesn't change tons, to be honest, particularly when you've got blocks like NATO that obviously have Article 5. We used the term states in the paper, but we actually clarified this early on that we use that synonymously with certain sorts of minilateral blocks as well. I don't want to act like SRM is, and I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about these sort of risk analysis. I don't want to work like it's just SRM and it's not. Both because physically SRM can be different, you know, as Seth said, but also marine cloud variety versus SAI maybe has very different things, or even the same SAI scheme with a automated deployment platform versus a manned deployment platform might have very different consequences. But also, as you say, the public, and this is what I'm trying to suggest, and I'm very interested in, is not this question. I think the biggest risks of SRM and the most likely pathways you get to these global catastrophes here are those that are socially mediated, are those that are mediated by rapid changes in public opinion, are the sorts of things which, scarily, I'm not sure I'm not sure how well we can make models that can tell us these facts. I'm not sure how well, you know, scaling up from small to get big helps mitigate. Hopefully it will help mitigate that somewhat. But how much does it do? Again, that's not necessarily a reason to say that it's going to be that we shouldn't do SRM, because climate change also has all these host of dangers. But it's a complication, you know, and so it's not. So when you say also it's states doing, you know, there's not just there's different deployment like positions and all things like this. It's not just that. It's also the attitudes of states. It's how big a religious, you know, how big a conspiracy theories around these. Are these marginal or are these very major? And finally, when you say
the biggest risk is not doing, the biggest risk is probably not doing it rather than doing it, given the types of simulations we've done.
It may, I don't think that's implausible. I'm not sure the evidence we can be confident in this. I think the very most dangerous scenarios are those where we do it and everything goes really, really badly wrong. But there may be scenarios that are basically equally as bad, which are there because we don't do it. Because they may get a point where it's like, oh, that's so bad, but actually, you know, you didn't do it and society collapses anyway. So
every
you know,
IPCC assessment has been worse than the last one. I mean, it's seen
yeah.
better. There are not ones that have been alleviated at all over time. So, okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Mike. Gideon, I don't know if you know Mike very well, but he's got decades of experience in, you know, working in the Livermore labs and federal government. So, you know, anyway, I mean, I'm sure you could go on discussing this for a long time. Rebecca.
Hi, Gideon. Look, I've read your papers before and I found them very exciting, and I'm glad you're doing this work because it does help me think about the issues. What I do think is that the method of sunlight reflection methods, or SRM, does matter. We were having a bit of a chat before you came online about politics and engagement here in Australia, and there is a big difference in the public's mind between MCB and SAI. So I want to encourage you to, like, the fact that you're doing this thinking does help define looking at risks and how things interplay geopolitically, but I actually think it makes a big difference whether it's MCB or SAI. And so in a moment, I'm going to ask you to see what you could do about that. But in terms of your framework, generating securitization is far more likely, in my opinion, from SAI than it is from MCB. And with just one statement, which we can't go into here, I'm aware in our lists, in our scientific lists, that there are people, you know, that it's a topic for another day, but a couple of really serious scientists think there are huge problems with altering the troposphere if SAI is used. So all I'm really saying is it may or may not be true, we don't know, but it may not just be scaremongering, it may be, you know, that the fear may be based in something. But anyway, my main question is, how do you think you could refine your framework to help people understand the differences between MCB and SAI?
Yeah, so I did try to at some stages address, so a number of the scenarios did address the sort of difference between MCB and SAI. And lots of them did indeed have them coming out as less, people consider it less plausibly dangerous. It's people are less likely to be up in arms about it. MCB seems generally more popular with the public. The thing you do get more of a danger with, seemingly with MCB than SAI, is the probability of more wild deployment scenarios, because obviously you get this greater homogenization in the stratosphere. You can do really crazy things with SAI if you just like put it in one hemisphere, but that's just not really a massively plausible scenario.
What was that word, Gideon? More with MCB, you get more something.
You can. I think you have more option space for wild deployment.
Wild. That's fine.
Which is
got it. Yeah. Thank you. That's exactly what. Yeah. Thank you.
Which is I'm not sure. Like, I think those need to be explored, because it could be they're just not that bad. It could be wild deployment's quite like it's not great, but it's still better than what the case would be under climate change, which would be a good finding. And that's the thing we do recommend in the workshop report, is we explore these more, like, basically these simulations of what it would look like to do MCB in particular, in ways that if you were just purely focused on the science would make no sense. But once politics comes into account, might do. So that's why whilst there's some elements in which I'm like, MCB could well be safer than SAI, there's other elements that mean it's not. I just would say, I hope that sort of provides an answer. I'd also like to just quickly reply to the idea that I'm trying to start a chain of logic as to not do SRM. As I mentioned right at the start of the talk, that's not what I'm doing. I'm not necessarily making an argument. This is someone in the chat that we shouldn't do SRM. I've just been trying to investigate the dangers so we could potentially make it safer, and we can make a good risk assessment of GCR. As I said, I don't think GCR should be the only consideration either. Even if, like, killing whatever the percentage of population you think it needs to be, 1 or 10%, the impacts of climate change are probably bad enough to warrant quite radical action already. And I'm not, we have our different priorities as to where we put these different risk assessments, but I'm not necessarily saying that we shouldn't do SRM or say that we should.
Thank you, Gideon. Yeah, we don't usually. Yeah, let's get to the folks in the queue here. Herb.
Thanks, Ron. First, I attended one or maybe two of your programs, Gideon. Oh, what was it, 3 years ago when you were running the youth group? I can't remember the name now, but I was very impressed, and I've sort of followed your career. I think I've seen you on Twitter here or there, so I'm delighted to see the work you're doing now. I don't know if that group if someone else has taken over the reins or what, but nonetheless, I was very heartened to see and participate in that webinar you had a few years ago. That said, I'm not going to ask or address SRM as much as a couple other peripheral questions. Well, I recently published a book on new climate vocabulary, and one of the terms I came up, not that I came across, not I came up with, was integrated catastrophe assessment, which I assume is related to GCR. And I saw a paper in 2022 that basically said, I'm looking at my book now, assess the potential for catastrophic consequences as the climate crisis continues to accelerate. The authors proposed that an integrated catastrophe assessment be undertaken on a regular basis. And as I write later on, which I won't quote, it just blew my mind that only in 2022 are people proposing an integrated catastrophe assessment of climate change. I mean, it's just another one of those mind-blowing things if the authors were correct or if I interpreted correctly. But also related to that, I think I understood you're saying that the field of I don't know exactly how you described or defined the field, but sort of related to collapse, which may not be exactly the same as the sort of the GCR, but I'm certainly familiar with a sort of what appears to be a significant increase, if not a burgeoning, of publications. I was involved in critiquing and reviewing a wonderful book called Breaking Together by Jem Bendell. I know Robert Chris is familiar with that. I don't know if you're familiar with that looks at all the major world components like agriculture and so forth, and how they're breaking, sort of simultaneously breaking down. There's the whole French school of collapsologists, I guess. You're probably much more familiar with them than I am, and I think those are important and necessary movements. And the last sort of comment question I have is that I hope and trust that in the course of your work and that of your colleagues, you're not overlooking the contribution of climate speculative fiction, the Kim Stanley Robinsons, the Neil Stephensons, and the others who write very imaginative and plausible to some degree or other scenarios that involve the kinds of conflict that you're trying to categorize and analyze. And it would even be helpful, if you haven't done so, to bring some of those folks into your discussions, because they're some of the most creative people around. So anyway, those are sort of, I'm not sure I have a question in there, but those are sort of some comments and observations.
Yeah, I guess because it's not a question, I'll be quick. Thanks for the kind words about Worldwood. Yeah, it's not really existing anymore, unfortunately. The organization, after I left, it sort of shut down about 6 to 8 months after I left or so. On this question of this, there is this sort of growing, burgeoning publications looking at GCR collapse and climate, but it is surprisingly thin. And I think there is much more work that needs to be done. And this is what I was trying to say. I think we can all say climate change seems very serious. I personally think it's plausibly a huge contributor to GCR, but I don't think yet we have as strongly grounded models of exactly how that could look. And I don't just mean physical models. I mean things like speculative fiction and a bunch of these other stuff about all the the pathways and ways we can reduce these, including radiation management and including other pathways as well. And I think there needs to be much more. A paper that laid out this case in PNAS last year, Climate Endgame, I assume I think it was Luke's paper that laid that out. But there's very few people in the academic space who are working sort of on these problems, even in the climate space. Even though RCP 8.5, which is in terms of emissions pathways, a completely implausible scenario, is very common, even in the literature. Even still, the literature focuses far more on lower temperature scenarios. And there was a big literature review in 2021, or not literature review, like I can't remember what they call it exactly, but basically study of the literature that found that the vast majority of literature was looking at 1.5. And we don't even understand what's the worst case scenario, let alone how high could temperatures get. We also don't understand what the worst case scenario for low temperature. That's my biggest worry, is that we get to really bad case scenarios with only 2 degrees of warming, or under 3. Isn't that we're hitting, my biggest worry isn't that we're going to be hitting 6 or so, but is that 3 might be enough. We don't know if it will or not, but we know our models couldn't tell us if it was. And that's really, it's not that our models, the sort of the integrated assessment models and all these sort of models tell us that everything will go crazy, but we know, and you all know this because a bunch of you have also done work on similar-ish things, but we know these models can't tell us if we could, which is pretty scary. And yeah, speculative fiction, I ran this scenario exercise, which I need to really write up. And the scenario exercise is related to speculative fiction. We did try to invite every author who's written a book on a fiction book on geoengineering to come to the workshop and participate, but unfortunately we didn't get any replies. And I would love to. I would love them to have been involved. We need more creative thinking in this space, both with how bad climate could get, how bad SRM could get, in plausible ways. It always needs to still be grounded in this plausibility. Which is very important.
Well, at least I'm glad you're trying. Just one, I know you want to run one, Ron, but just one quick comment, and that is like in so many other fields in academia and other areas, the social and peer pressure to not get involved in this is so strong. Just like the social acceptance and not getting involved in SRM research or advocacy. And, Jim Bendell, who was maybe, the first with his infamous paper in 2018, I mean, he was just crucified and for having the nerve to say that, the so the climate emperor doesn't have any clothes. Hopefully that's got to change, but that's not an easy process.
And I was heartened in my work with how many people, both those who we might say are advocates for SRM and those who are critical and really across the spectrum, were really actually willing to engage with this issue. I got a lot of help from a lot of people who, and I couldn't have done this work without them. So there is I think we're perhaps lucky in the SRM space that a lot of people are willing to take into account and really face some of these problems head on. But we need more. You know, now I've stopped working on this full time. There's no one full time working on worst case and actual plausible worst case scenarios involving SRM and how we can reduce the likelihood of those happening.
Okay, thank you, Gideon. Robert.
Thanks, Gideon. I would like to say that the recent findings on the collapse of planetary albedo do suggest that rebrightening, increasing planetary albedo is an urgent security requirement but it's something that, as Mike McCracken was saying, needs to be developed in an incremental way. And I see the potential for marine cloud brightening to be deployed within national jurisdictions, notably in Australia or in international waters that won't affect other jurisdictions, as a really important starting point, and that will then, I'm quite convinced that it will show to the world community that the benefits far outweigh the risks, and that can then start to open up the suggestion of cross-jurisdictional deployment of stratospheric aerosol injection. And of course, the problem with SAI being that it can't be done within a national jurisdiction, whereas MCB can. So that's a comment, and you're welcome to respond.
Yeah, this doesn't seem impossible to me. As I said, I'm not always trying to deal with what's likely. I'm trying to deal with plausible worst cases. So I happen to think everything, and this is pretty important, I happen to think everything I've said today is really quite unlikely to happen. I think the most likely SRM scenario is something close to a muddling through, be it that we do it or be it that we don't. But that's also because I tend to lean on the more optimistic scenarios, and I know a lot of people don't. But anyway, there is this sense of I think it seems very plausible. Marine cloud brightening could be certainly easier to get from a governance perspective, irrespective of its scientific benefits or not. And I think that's true. This is also, but this capacity for states to do it in their own jurisdictions is one of the reasons I'm perhaps a little bit worried about this wild deployment. In particular, sort of, states sort of doing it more regionally in their own waters, and this be done very asymmetrically and very patchily across the Earth. I don't know how bad that could get. Maybe the answer is not that bad, but we basically haven't modeled that. And that seems like a relatively easy and low cost thing to model to see, because, it may, if we find out that's very dangerous, this may really cause more, could be an impetus for more global agreements over this, or provide us, at least allow us to be more informed as to the risks and benefits, of regional, this sort of patchwork regional MCB just has not been crazily modeled, particularly if it's, fluctuating over quite short time periods, when states are doing it and then a new election happens and they stop, and India's going to do it loads, but the US is going to ban it anywhere that's close to its borders, and it's going to happen off the coast of Australia, but nowhere in the Atlantic Ocean. What does this do to the Earth system? We need an international albedo union that will be able to provide scientific governance, and so moving forward on that is important. Thank you. But we could also model that stuff now. Like the scientists working on MCB just could do these sorts of studies now. It's not, it's not beyond our knowledge or our understanding to do this.
We need funding.
Unfortunately, I literally can't help with that.
Okay, thank you, Robert. I'm gonna take my turn in the queue here. I think one of the Gideon, I feel like you've sort of entered the cave of all these old folks who are just telling you that you don't know what you're talking about, or you're not sufficiently experienced in all this stuff. But I do applaud. I think that's not true. I think you're quite, you have studied this a lot. You have thought about it a lot. You've talked with a lot of other folks who do have a lot of experience. But I do. So I just wanted to start with that. I think we really want to encourage you, not sort of slam you down. But I think part of the reservations that perhaps others are feeling, that I certainly am, is that the obvious thing is we need cooling. We need direct cooling now, not in 10 years, not more research. I mean, we do need more research. More research is always good, but the priorities are skewed. The priority should be cooling if we really want to reduce catastrophe and reduce all these possible calamitous events. And when you start from that premise, the question is, how do you do this? And we put out a paper with 16 different possible methods. Many of them have, not only are they almost no risk or low risk, but they also have all kinds of other side benefits. And we've also put out the notion that you need to think of this as a spectrum, as you pilot things, and you should pilot SAI. As Mike was saying, I think, many of us believe that, you could do something like the Coalition of the Willing International Space Station, try and build confidence, build public trust, be open about it, just make it the countries that are willing. And there are not very many countries that are actually able to do this right now. If you talk to Doug McMartin, he's pointed out that the aircraft technology is really shared by very, very few countries, and anybody who does this, including India or anyone else, would have to get the implicit agreement from these other countries to deploy these kind of technologies. But anyway, the point is, I think it would be my concern anyway is that you should be talking. Climate. The climate disaster is upon us. That's not a risk. That's something that's happening. So instead of posing all these hypothetical risk of of this very kind of abstract, I think, one-dimensional concept of SRM, like the Big Bang, theory of you seem to be talking about SAI mostly, but I don't think, I think it would, starting from a framing of how do we get the cooling done? How best can we do that? How can we build confidence? How can we roll this out? Would be more useful. So that I think that's, because we've been having these discussions with David Keith, with all these people, and our allies. These are allies who are really researching SAI and thinking about it seriously, and they're saying, well, we need another 10 years. The academic conventional view right now in many quarters is research only. God forbid you do any attempt at testing or deployment, and that's where I think many of us are saying, look, you don't really learn how to do this until you start small and start pilot testing. You get agreement from the Arctic powers and the Antarctic powers, and try and do it in local areas and so forth. I mean, that's how you build the ability to do this in a trustworthy way. So. And it should be multifaceted, so it's not the termination shock. So you have multiple, you have MCB, all kinds of different ways of going. So you're not dependent on one sort of silver bullet to save the world, which seems to be the thinking of a lot of these termination shock people. Anyway, I'm dragging on, and I will stop there.
Yeah, I think that. Firstly, yeah, I think there's quite a few responses. I have not, as you said, in response to your sort of early thing, I'm not particularly put off by the response. I was sort of imagining this would be close to the response that my work would get here. But I think that there is this question of, essentially, I think that it's something like. Whilst it may be true that some people want to be thinking about how to do this cooling, I still think, and I really, and I think it's important. I think people got the wrong end of the stick earlier on partially because, you know, you guys are all, I know how concerned you are with climate change. I'm sort of normally the one having to say in the GCR community, no, just because climate change hasn't been researched majorly as this contributor, like does not mean that this thing is not hugely important. You know, I think climate change is ridiculously important. But you know, in this work, and I think it's an important angle, I'm not saying it's the only angle, but it's an important angle, is to consider all the range of possible risks. Because I don't, you know, I don't just care about the climate crisis. When I'm doing my work on this, I care about humanity. I care about people. I care about the safety and stability of society, of human civilization, and avoiding those things. And this means that you have to take into account a number of other hazards. SRM doesn't exist in a vacuum. Maybe it will, you know, maybe we will just be faced with the technical problems. That'll be great, you know. And as I said, none of my work was really, I almost started from a very optimistic premise that basically we can get SRM that you know, if we wanted it to, as it were, could just like work pretty well. I wasn't investigating, you know, those questions of tool. I think that's, but I was starting from that with this premise partially because I think it's mostly right. I think it's, you know, as I said early on, I think if you had a single benign, you know, global organization working on this, you'd sort out the problem. You wouldn't have it. You wouldn't, a lot of these contributors to GCR would be very low. But we don't necessarily live in that world. We maybe do if SRM is non-politicized and non-securitized. You know, that's one of the reasons, and you can sort of get along with it. But, you know, and then when you're scaling up, you know, oh, well, you're scaling up both to buy more support for this, you know, strong and stable governance regime. Again, when I was discussing governance regime, that's why strength and stability is so important. But I'm not sure we live in that world. We maybe do. I hope we do, because that would make solving the climate crisis a lot easier, as well as, you know, on top of doing the cooling, it also makes, you know, doing the mitigation and the CDR and the adaptation far easier. But I'm not sure we live in that world. Just because we live in a world that maybe, you know, also the SRM be more dangerous than I think you guys think it will be, does not mean that that's a world where the SRM is more dangerous than not doing it. It also doesn't mean the other way around either. Because there isn't just the, as I've stressed throughout, and as I stressed with termination shock, it isn't, and I was constantly going into this idea of, you know, termination shock isn't going to be because we suddenly forget how to do SRM or because one system gets taken out. Because even one system gets taken out, you know, if you're doing SAI, you've got years. You know, if you're doing MCB, you have slightly less time before some of the impacts start hitting in. If you're doing other programs, you know, space-based programs, okay, well, there's a little bit worse, and cirrus cloud thinning and other radiation, you know, methods, they have different timescales, but you have time that you could, if you sort of all banded together and, you know, and really tried to solve the problem, that you could come together and do this. That's why I was constantly going in the risk of conflict. How does this happen? It's one state tries to force other states not to. I think this is the problem. The problem is not a world where we all, you know, the world where we all band together, we realize how serious climate change is a problem, that climate change is a serious problem, although not a problem we should risk nuclear war over, and potentially is a major contributor to global catastrophic risk, as well as other issues regarding justice and all sorts of other problems. We band together and we do a series of, you know, of cooling and mitigation and you sort of this portfolio. This sort of, that world is a world where GCR, where SRM is really helpful, but it's also probably a world where GCR is lower than I think necessarily the world we're in. So we need to, you know, we need to deal with the fact that we're living in a world where people are irrational, where states pursue their own interests, where climate change is not top priorities. And when you say we're doing the scaling up, that might help us know some of the technical risks, but some of these risks that we identified, things like major shifts in public opinion, major rises of populism after decades, perhaps, of technocratic rule and stuff, are not the thing that can be safety tested for by scaling up each of these technologies. That's not the thing where you can run a nice controlled experiment. It's the thing that you have to try and mitigate, try and reduce. And maybe we think, you know, maybe we think that risk is low enough that the benefits of SRM just far outweigh the possible negative consequences of that. I don't think that's an implausible world we're in. But we need to know, you know, we need to know these answers. We need to have some idea of, you know, of the contours of the day. We're in a dangerous world we've put ourselves in. Irrespective of what action we take, we're in a dangerous world. We just need to try and work out which ones are the more helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, I will. I'm a radical economist, as you may know, and so I'm well aware that the world is a very dangerous place and fraught with power and all kinds of other conflicts. But anyway, the experts on SRM, Doug McMartin and Mike and other folks generally agree that the natural risk is not certainly not as large as being presented. Anyway, but okay, I'll Dennis, for last but not least here, we're running over. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ron, and congratulations to you, Gideon. I think that it was a very, very stimulating, if a bit uncomfortable, presentation for all of us. I have a very brief question, and it was something that came up in a discussion I had with Ron just the other day when I was speculating that there must be some serious SRM scenario work along the lines of what you're doing, the modeling of scenarios related to securitization that is going on deep in the bowels of the US Defense Department, the State Department, the UK government, the Chinese military. Would suspect that they're already working on this issue. For example, I'd be surprised if there wasn't already a group at the Rand Corporation, for example, contracted by the Defense Department working on this to provide government with some confidential guidance on the securitization scenarios. So I was wondering, do you have any whiff of such work being done by governments, undercover, of course, most likely, to actually address these kind of issues as you have gone about your work? What do you think is the situation there?
We know there's some work. We know that that both the US, in the US government, in the US Defense, I think it's in the Pentagon, but I'm not sure exactly where it is. And we know in China, there definitely is some work. Rand has put out a few things, but not tons. We also, my impression is also it's less than you might expect. But I think this, and this is why I sort of stress this securitization point so much. I think it's still very much within the power of how this is shaped in the public discourse. That it's not already been securitized. It's not already been pulled in. What you don't have is, for instance, which you might consider would be the sort of thing, is people that had published prolifically on SRM suddenly, mostly disappearing off the radar in terms of publications of anything. This is one way you often know that stuff happens in government and stuff, because these people will go get contracted at government and then, and then they just stop doing their open work. We've not seen this. And you'd expect there would be more with. We know there are people interested. And when I come to the wild deployment scenarios, which I discussed, which sort of links back into one of the things Ron said about natural risks not being high, I agree. We know there's interest from the defense departments in that sort of stuff, because they take that as a very serious possibility that states would, that it's not going to happen in a way that's scientifically sound, as it were. It's going to happen in a way that's a bit, from a scientific perspective, stupid. Like, why are you doing it like this? On the flip side, there is less than I think you'd expect. There is some interest, and there's been a couple of papers also that's done interviews with people in these security establishments. I think who was it? Ben Sovacool, I think, Benjamin Sovacool published a paper interviewing some security experts around this last year. So there's some interest. But actually, also, you look at the sort of thing they're saying, and compared to where most of the mainstream conversation is in the SRM community, the idea that weaponization is basically impossible. Certainly, these security experts that they interviewed were not quite there yet. So I think in many ways I've been surprised by how little there's been of this. But this can change in an instant. If someone becomes interested, these departments move people around, run things. If someone becomes interested and starts to see this as really significant, which could happen, because I know there are teams in each of these that have done work on this.
Thank you.
Hey, Thank you, Gideon. It's been a very stimulating talk. And again, I hope, we're going to count on you to figure out a way to do this. Somebody needs to figure out how to cool the planet, or, we're cooked. So, hopefully, that will, folks like you will be on that. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for hanging in here, and